Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Not even the worldly Taoist, immortal imperator, ensconced as he was in Bai Xiaochun's body, could possibly stand up to the pressure of such a powerful expert, dead as he was. The worldly Taoist of the moment was only an expression of focus and will, and Bai Xiaochun himself was only an archean. Therefore, that focus and will could only unleash a fraction of its original battle prowess. Furthermore, the immortal world was now nothing but ruins. Therefore, the worldly Taoist currently only possessed about 20% of his true strength. Even if my true self had come here years in the past, I still wouldn't have been able to remain in the presence of this corpse for long, nor could I have touched it. In fact, he didn't even dare to step onto the ship itself. If he did, he would most certainly be destroyed in body and soul. This corpse was so incredibly strong that it defied imagination. It had such an incredible level of power that it was astonishing to think how strong this person must have been when he was alive. That was what the worldly Taoist's tenacious will was considering at the moment. Although there were still many things he didn't understand, one thing was for certain: he had settled one suspicion long held in his heart. The will of death that suffused the corpse allowed him to identify its Tao. It was the Tao of death, and also a Tao of apocalyptic extermination. It was a Tao in which, in the very end, only one person existed, desolate, cold, and selfish to the extreme. It was a Tao in which success meant the destruction of the starry sky, the eradication of all life, and the end of all creation. As the surrounding corrosive mists ate away at the sovereign will which held Bai Xiaochun in its grip, it was possible to see countless evil ghosts flitting to and fro, just waiting to rip the flesh off of his bones and consume him entirely. The Tao of this unknown, supremely powerful entity is also the mortal renegade's Tao? The worldly Taoist's questions were mostly answered after being able to see this corpse and identify its Tao. Years ago, the mortal renegade entered this place and should have died. Instead, he acquired some astonishing good fortune. It seems, he must have touched the corpse. The sovereign will that surrounded Bai Xiaochun's body was almost gone, which meant that he would soon be exposed to the cloudy mists. And yet, who could kill an expert as powerful as this? The worldly Taoist looked down quietly at the corpse for a moment longer, continuing to sense the towering will of death that it emanated. And yet, he could find no further answers. And he also knew that he never would. The stream of tenacious focus that had occupied Bai Xiaochun's body was about to slip away into nothing. At that point, his thoughts would no longer exist. In the past, his divine soul and fleshly body had been killed, and right now, the only thing that had returned was a bit of his mind. Sighing, he turned and walked away from the ship, and out of the valley and its clouds. As he left, his voice echoed behind him. "Mortal renegade, are you, still you? If you are, then did you become the successor of the corpse in that ship? Why does it seem to me that the corpse died, but his Tao lived on, and was reborn because of karma?" Outside the valley, Bai Xiaochun remained still, staring at the swirling clouds, waiting for the most important person in his existence to appear again. Mixed emotions filled his heart. On the one hand, he wanted to see his old master, the returned worldly Taoist, immortal imperator. On the other hand, he didn't want to see Bai Xiaochun hurt because of it. The words the worldly Taoist had spoken through Bai Xiaochun's mouth moments ago had softened his heart, but at the same time, had caused profound emotions to rise up in him. He didn't have to wait for long before a figure strode out of the clouds. At first, Bai Xiaochun couldn't quite see who it was, causing his heart to pound with anxiety. But soon, he could see clearly, it was none other than Bai Xiaochun. "My lord," Bai Xiaochun exclaimed, hurrying forward, nervous, unsure of whether this person was the worldly Taoist or not. Upon emerging from the clouds, his eyes were closed, and he stood there quietly for a long time. Not daring to say anything, Bai Xiaochun simply stood there. Enough time passed for an incense stick to burn, and the sovereign will began to fade away. Only a tiny bit remained, although it still pulsed with domineering, supreme power. Winds still swirled through the area, and the void trembled. As far as Bai Xiaochun could remember, the aura he was sensing was exactly the same as that of his former master, the worldly Taoist. Before Bai Xiaochun could do anything, Bai Xiaochun's eyes opened. They seemed profoundly ancient, as though they were looking out from countless years into the past. It was almost as if he had been reborn. Also within that ancientness was grief for the loss of home, family, friends, and loved ones. It was a sorrow abundant in helplessness and confusion. As of this moment, Bai Xiaochun was absolutely certain that the person in front of him wasn't Bai Xiaochun, but rather, his former master. Excited, he dropped to his knees to kowtow, tears dripping down his nose onto the ground. Bai Xiaochun's hand reached out to touzle Bai Xiaoqi's hair. Ah Xiao Kai, he said gently, crying again, are we? When he heard that, Bai Xiaoqi started to weep, and crawled forward to hug Bai Xiaochun's leg, just the way a child would his father's. Don't cry, Xiao Kai. A warm smile appeared on Bai Xiaochun's face. You've done great, kid. I know it wasn't easy for you through the years. But you know, you could do better. Deep down, this Bai Xiaochun is a simple and honest person. A true warrior, bursting with righteousness. He is imposing, elegant, stately, and far more talented than me. It seems a rare hero has truly arisen, a rarely seen chosen. Somewhere in the middle of his speech, Bai Xiaoqi stopped crying, seemingly a bit startled by the worldly Taoist's assessment of Bai Xiaochun. My lord, this Bai Xiaochun, before Bai Xiaoqi could go on, he was interrupted. It's too bad he wasn't alive back in my day, otherwise I probably would never have become a sovereign. However, had he been there at that time, it's highly likely things would have ended differently. It was possible to see Bai Xiaochun's eyes flickering with reminiscence, and the grief about him was nearly palpable. Bai Xiaoqi had been about to interject, but when he saw that level of sadness, he held back. However, he simply couldn't understand why the immortal imperator would have such an impression of Bai Xiaochun. Then he started to wonder if perhaps the Bai Xiaochun he had seen was simply the non-heroic version. I have to leave, but before I do, I have one final mission for you. Taking a deep breath, Bai Xiaochun cast a very serious gaze at Bai Xiaoqi. The spirit automaton's face suddenly grew very earnest, as though he couldn't wait to hear what this new mission was. Remember my words. From now on, you must always obey Bai Xiaochun. Don't ever trick him. Listen carefully to everything he has to say, and do everything he asks. Whatever orders he gives you, you must view as importantly as if they came from me. When he asks you to do things, you do them, to the fullest extent possible. When he wants something, you help him get it. Trust him. Come to his aid when others bully him. Being with him is the greatest good fortune you could ever come across, Xiao Kai. Also, do your best to make him happy, which will in turn make you happy. Rejoice with him, grieve with him. When he is not happy, join him in his sorrow. Very well, Xiao Kai. This is my last mission to you. Will you accept it? By the time he finished speaking, his tone of voice was completely strict and somber. Bai Xiaoqi was somewhat stunned, and if it weren't for the aura that he could clearly sense, he would suspect that these words hadn't actually been uttered by the worldly Taoist. Looking at the serious glint in his master's eyes, he gritted his teeth and said, "Yes, sir." The serious look on Bai Xiaochun's face vanished, to be replaced by pure warmth. Once again touzling Bai Xiaoqi's hair, he offered a few more parting words of encouragement, then closed his eyes. Bai Xiaoqi looked on, heart twinging with pain as he knew that this would be the last time he ever saw his master. After Bai Xiaochun closed his eyes, the tension built for a moment, only to be broken when Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes again. Seemingly a bit worried about Bai Xiaoqi's sincerity, he said, "Although I'm leaving, I'll come back occasionally to look over you." As Bai Xiaoqi looked on, stunned, Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat and closed his eyes again. Bai Xiaoqi looked a bit suspicious and hesitant. He was absolutely certain that he had sensed the aura of his former master, the worldly Taoist. But the words he had heard just now seemed exactly like something the shameless and fraudulent Bai Xiaochun would love to say. The worldly Taoist had been one of the most powerful sovereigns in existence. How could he possibly say such mind-numbingly shocking things? But because of that aura, Bai Xiaoqi had no way of telling for sure. As Bai Xiaoqi looked on hesitantly, Bai Xiaochun stood there, his eyes closed and expression somber, feeling very pleased with himself. Although the worldly Taoist's tenacious will had taken over his body temporarily, he had remained conscious the entire time, viewing everything as though via an out-of-body experience. At first, he had been quite shocked, especially by Bai Xiaoqi's tears. At that time, Bai Xiaochun had snorted in his heart, but paid little attention. He had been more focused on the fear of seeing himself walk into those clouds, and then seeing that lonely-looking ship, and the corpse upon it. Bai Xiaochun had sensed everything that the worldly Taoist had been able to sense. All of it had caused him to wail with inward grief and fear. The mists in that valley were simply too dangerous, and had slowly been wearing away at the protective will that surrounded his body. Only after walking out of the mists did the worldly Taoist's tenacious will eventually fade away. From that point on, there was no way for the worldly Taoist to influence Bai Xiaochun in any way. In the end, it was actually good fortune for Bai Xiaochun. Although the worldly Taoist's tenacious will was only with him for a short time, it left behind some of his aura. And Bai Xiaochun could control that aura at will. In some ways, he had actually become the worldly Taoist. Although he didn't have his battle prowess, he could definitely use that aura to strike fear into the hearts of others. Even as he realized that, he saw Bai Xiaochun in front of him, looking very torn. Then he thought about Bai Xiaochun throwing his arms around the worldly Taoist's legs. It was something he had never experienced before, and therefore, he pretended to be the worldly Taoist. His ruse startled Bai Xiaochun, but seemed to work perfectly. Hopefully, it would ensure that in the future, it was easier to keep the spirit automaton under control. Bai Xiaochun was definitely feeling wonderful about how everything had played out, especially considering that he had been able to emerge from the valley unscathed. Now that he was sure he was safe, he kept his eyes closed for a while longer, then opened them. In order to make the act more realistic, he shrieked, and looked around in alarm. What happened? Damn it, why am I standing right here? I feel like I just fell asleep, then woke up, and can't remember anything from before. Face ashen, and eyes filled with horror, he flew at top speed back to the treasured fan. Bai Xiaochun was actually more suspicious now than before, but had no way to uncover the truth. Therefore, he simply sighed, resigned himself to fate, and followed Bai Xiaochun back to the fan. Apparently, Bai Xiaochun was worried that he had overacted a bit, which was always one of his weaknesses. Back at the fan, he looked solemnly at Bai Xiaochun, and asked him all sorts of questions about what had occurred after he went unconscious. Before, Bai Xiaochun would never have told him the truth, or at least, would not have gone into much detail. Unless Bai Xiaochun resorted to threatening him with the name-changing tactic, then he would never have wasted his time. But now, the final mission given to him by his master was still on his mind. Therefore, he explained everything, and then gave his own interpretation of the final words of the immortal Imperator. The worldly Taoist bore you no ill will. In fact, as his tenacious will was fading away, he even praised you. Bai Xiaochun seemed worried that Bai Xiaochun might be angry at the worldly Taoist, and therefore, prepared to offer some advice about the situation. And yet, to his surprise, Bai Xiaochun shivered, waved his hand, and interrupted, "There's no need to say it. The worldly Taoist is basically my own master. Without him, I would have perished. And I would never have reached the Archean realm. If he wants to use my body, he can do it any time. I'd go through hell and high water for the old man. If the worldly Taoist, immortal Imperator, speaks, then I, Bai Xiaochun, wouldn't even bat an eyelid in response. I'm the type of person who knows the difference between gratitude and grudges. And I'm going to remember what he did for me for the rest of my life." He sounded completely awe-inspiring and righteous, as if he were speaking from the bottom of his heart, with complete and utter sincerity. In response, Bai Xiaochun was visibly moved, and suddenly felt profound respect for Bai Xiaochun. "My lord," Bai Xiaochun was simply too naive, and immediately thought back to all of the things the worldly Taoist had said about Bai Xiaochun. At that point, he decided that the worldly Taoist must have affected Bai Xiaochun on a profound level. After all, the Bai Xiaochun of this moment seemed to perfectly match the worldly Taoist's earlier description. Excited, he told himself that he definitely had to do just as the worldly Taoist had bid him, and do everything he could to take care of Bai Xiaochun. Filled with enthusiasm, he immediately took control of the treasured fan and, just as Bai Xiaochun had ordered earlier, pushed it out into the void with all the power and speed he could muster. An encouraging smile could be seen on Bai Xiaochun's face as all of this happened. Feeling very pleased with how much more awesome he was than before, he sat down cross-legged. As of this moment, he had an Archean cultivation base, and yet, his primary goals had not changed. He still wanted to conjure 30 colored flame. He had reached another bottleneck with 29 colored flame, a bottleneck that required a higher cultivation base. Now that he was in the Archean realm, he focused completely on the formula for 29 colored flame, and began to perform various auguries and calculations. Now that he could back that with the divine sense of an Archean, everything went far faster and more efficiently than before. It didn't take long to make some necessary adjustments to the formula, whereupon he flicked his sleeve and produced a huge quantity of souls. Back when he was a celestial, his failures had been partly due to the difficulty of the formula, and partly because his cultivation base couldn't sustain the effort. But now, he had resolved all of the problems. His conjuring efforts went unprecedentedly smoothly. A short month later, just as the fan was flying out of the ruins of the immortal world, a dazzlingly bright light appeared, which was a 29 colored flame. So close. Now all I need is 30 colored flame. After feeding the 29 colored flame into Bai Hao's mark on the back of his hand, it was to his delight that he could sense Bai Hao's life force thrumming with activity. It was as if there were only a slight barrier that needed to be broken through to resurrect him. Excited, he was just about to keep pressing forward to try to conjure a 30-colored flame all in one session, when suddenly his expression flickered. Turning to look out into the void, he waved his finger. In response, a certain area off in the distance began to sink down as the powers of gravity were unleashed. Time seemed to distort, much to the shock of Bai Xiaochun. But then, even as Bai Xiaochun realized what must be happening, he pushed the fan forward with greater speed. Meanwhile, dozens of beams of Archean luminescence shot out into the void. Archean slaves, Bai Xiaochun shouted, his eyes glittering. His 2 Archean slaves materialized, then flew off of the fan out into the void. At around that time, the howl of the old ghost woman echoed out from the spot of distorted time and space. Damn it, are you ever going to give up? I can't believe you set an ambush for me here. Before, Bai Xiaochun would have been scared out of his mind. But now, he was in the Archean realm, and was filled with confidence. Flicking his sleeve, he looked out into the void, battle spirit boiling. Well, the immortal world did give me the last bit of its chi flow. And the worldly Taoist treated me with great kindness. His Taoist partner died a horrible death. Emotionally and logically, I know I shouldn't be fighting her. Bai Xiaochun was not the type of person to completely ignore matters of justice. Even though this old ghost woman had attacked him over and over again, and clearly wanted to kill him, he still knew the importance of repaying kindnesses. Taking a deep breath, he suppressed his desire to do battle, and ordered his Archean slave to stop moving. He also forced the 10 beams of Archean luminescence to pause before they could reach the area of suppressed time and space. Then, he pondered what he could do to stop the woman from trying to chase him down and kill him. Before he could put much thought into the matter, the void seemed to be shattered by the increasingly intense cries of the old ghost woman. Finally, she appeared within the region of distorted gravity, blurry at first. However, she quickly turned clear, and began to race toward Bai Xiaochun. She moved with such incredible speed that, within moments she was only a few hundred meters away from the treasured fan. However, that seemed her limit. She was still tied in place by the gravitational distortion, to the point where she looked long and stretched out. Bai Xiaochun was initially startled, but when he saw that she was temporarily unable of chasing after him, he cleared his throat, walked to the edge of the fan, and then clasped hands and bowed. Honored Immortal Imperatrix, I am your junior, Bai Xiaochun. I inherited the Tao of the exalted worldly Taoist, and have the last bit of chi flow from the immortal world. I know that I offended you in the past, ma'am, but I hope that I can do something to make up for that. Looking very sincere, he yet again clasped hands and bowed. However, the only response he got was an angered howl. The main difference was that this time, there were sinister words to accompany her shrill cry. I want your soul. Her words thrummed with murderous intentions, and the most profound of killing intent. Clearly, she wanted to kill Bai Xiaochun, not because of how he had stolen her own subordinates, but because of something special about his soul, something that filled her with greed, and the overwhelming desire to consume him. When Bai Xiaochun heard her words, his eyes glittered, and he flicked his sleeve. Staring at the old ghost woman, he coolly said, Senior, are you saying that if I don't give you my soul, you'll keep chasing me forever until you manage to kill me? The only response was a quivering howl of rage that caused his zone of time influence to begin to shatter. Clearly, the old ghost woman was about to break free at any moment. The worldly Taoist, immortal Imperator, was a bosom buddy of mine. Clearly, the only thing left of you, immortal Imperatrix, is a tattered, discarnate soul. You have changed, ma'am. You have committed unforgivable crimes. Without the slightest hesitation, he strode forward, sending his divine sense out and ordering his 2 Archean slaves to attack immediately. In the blink of an eye, Archean battle prowess was unleashed in devastating fashion. Even as the rumbling sounds echoed out, Bai Xiaochun released the 10 beams of Archean luminescence, which glittered dazzlingly as they joined the Archean slaves' attack on the old ghost woman. In the exact moment that the old ghost woman struggled free, the divine abilities of the Archean slaves, as well as the deadly Archean luminescence, pierced through her. The ghost woman's body immediately began to break apart, and then, it exploded. As her body fell apart, streams of black flame erupted out, sweeping through the area. At the same time, a sea of flames built up behind her, forming into a beautiful face that was twisted with rage, and filled with boundless madness and animosity. The face screamed, sending out sound waves that caused the black fire to transform into numerous ghost heads, which shot toward Bai Xiaochun with gaping maws and mountain-toppling, sea-draining power. Bai Xiaochun merely shook his head. Although the immortal Imperatrix's powers seemed shocking, and had been so intimidating in the past that he had always fled immediately, now he could sense that they were little to worry about. Leave, he said, I'll give you one more chance. However, the immortal Imperatrix didn't fall back. Instead, she sent more ghost faces flying out of the sea of fire. Bai Xiaochun's eyes glittered icily, but he didn't personally attack. Instead, he sent some divine sense into the treasured fan, causing the lonely boat therein to vanish and reappear out in the void. There, it turned into a bright beam of light that swirled around the fan, destroying any ghost face which touched it. After destroying countless ghost faces, it changed directions, heading toward the immortal Imperatrix. The anger in her eyes grew more intense as she suddenly shattered, transforming into a horde of white lamps, the power of which began to spread out, altering the natural laws of the void to turn everything it touched into paper. The two Archean slaves were influenced, and the lonely boat, despite not being turned into paper, was significantly slowed down. Dodging the boat, the immortal Imperatrix shot toward the fan, reaching out toward Bai Xiaochun with a clawed ghost hand. "Enough," he said, glaring. He had been holding back this entire time, and now, his patience had run thin. In the end, he was not the worldly Taoist. Besides, after how things were playing out, he was certain that the tenacious will of the worldly Taoist was no longer there to affect him. If it were, he would already have noticed its influence. On the one hand, he had hoped to use this situation to test that very aspect, and on the other hand, hadn't wanted to repay kindness with enmity. But now, he had reached the point where he couldn't hold back any longer. He had made his decision. As the vengeful soul of the immortal Imperatrix closed in, he stepped forward, blurring into motion. He actually moved so fast that he shot through her, and then appeared behind her. Facial expression the same as ever, he raised his hand toward the howling immortal Imperatrix, and then softly pushed forward. That simple motion summoned an enormous vortex around his hand, causing rumbling sounds to echo out as the immortal Imperatrix's soul was pulled toward him. Her enormous body began to shrink, causing a shrill scream to escape her lips. As Bai Xiaochun hovered there calmly, his Archean cultivation base erupted with power, clearly enough to shake the discarnate soul of the immortal Imperatrix. Unable to fight back against this level of power, the discarnate soul shattered, transforming into a huge cloud of smaller souls that began to flee in all directions. There were tens of millions of them, obscuring everything in sight, and while some of them lunged on Bai Xiaochun, most just attempted to escape. Furthermore, it was impossible to tell which of them was the actual soul of the immortal Imperatrix, and which were smaller souls that had been buried within her. Bai Xiaochun frowned, aware that if the immortal Imperatrix escaped, then she would likely continue to pester him, and if she chased him all the way to the eternal immortal domains, that could cause further unnecessary complications. Shaking his head, he closed his eyes, whereupon his aura changed, simultaneously spreading out, filling the area with a supreme aura. It was none other than the aura of the worldly Taoist. Bai Xiaochun shivered, and the countless souls in the area lurched to a halt. Trembling, the souls turned to look at Bai Xiaochun as his divine sense locked down onto one particular soul. It was the soul of a woman. She looked ordinary, but there was a black mark on her forehead. Even as she looked at Bai Xiaochun, he vanished, to reappear right in front of her. Reaching out, he grabbed her and tossed her into his bag of holding. He knew without a doubt that she was the immortal Imperatrix. He didn't hurt her, he just took her. Afterward, he looked around at the sea of souls surrounding him, his eyes glittering. "I don't want to hurt the immortal Imperatrix, but as for the rest of you, you'll be a big help with my flame conjuring. I'll count you lot toward interest." Clearing his throat, he produced a handful of soul convergence pills which he tossed out into the void as he proceeded to harvest souls. On this extended journey through the void, Bai Xiaochun's only goal was to conjure a tongue of 30-colored flame, and resurrect his apprentice, Bai Hao. As the years passed, he conjured more tongues of 29-colored flame, and at the same time, stabilized his place within the Archean realm. Along the way, he drew closer and closer to his goal. His higher cultivation base ensured that his auguries regarding 30-colored flame achieved success much more quickly. Combined with all of his previous knowledge and experiences, the formula gradually began to take shape in his mind. He still had no way to know whether or not 30 colors was the ultimate limit. However, he soon reached the point where his formula was complete. The next step was to use his accumulation of souls to start the conjuring process. With the successive failures that would result, he would eventually perfect the formula and conjure the flame. He was no longer worried about having enough souls. After capturing the immortal Imperatrix, and collecting the seemingly innumerable souls that she had collected, he now had more than enough to go about his work. Failures with 30-colored flame could have negative ramifications if they occurred near the eternal immortal domains, and thus, he temporarily chose not to return. "It won't be long now," he murmured. Heart pounding with anticipation, he continued his work. He performed test after test with actual souls, to the point where he failed dozens of times. Although it was great practice, years and years passed during that time. As he saw success getting closer and closer, his excitement built. Now that he was an Archean, there were more places within the void that he could actually enter and explore. He had visited dozens of various ruins throughout the years, although he had simply scanned many smaller areas with divine sense, and not bothered to personally explore them. One day, he sat cross-legged on the fan, a multicolored sea of fire swirling in front of him. Suddenly, it winked out of existence, causing a frown to appear on his face. Only one last step in the process. But I still keep failing. He was frustrated, but at the same time, aware that his failure might have something to do with how excited he was. Convinced that this was the case, he closed his eyes and forced himself into a state of calm. After banishing his worries about possible failures, he reached yet another new understanding of 30-colored flame. He spent an entire month reaching a state of utter calm. Just when he was about to proceed with another test, his expression flickered, and he looked down at the mark on his hand. Bai Xiao's mark was pulsing with fluctuations that seemed to indicate that something existed in the area that was profoundly stimulating. Surprised, Bai Xiaochun looked out into the void, and then sent his divine sense out to scan the area. At first, the darkness of the void seemed the same as always. But then, Bai Xiaochun rose to his feet as, far off in the distance, he caught sight of what appeared to be a candle. As he got closer, he saw that it wasn't a candle but rather, several sources of light, although he couldn't tell what exactly they were. This was the first light Bai Xiaochun had seen in the void during his entire journey. The old ghost woman had her lamp, but that was filled with an aura of death. And although the immortal world had something of a glow, it was nothing like what he was looking at now, a shining light that seemed to represent life force. It was quite a surprise. After all, his journeys through the void had revealed to him nothing but death. And he also knew that the mortal renegade had slaughtered everything in the starry sky, reducing it to what was essentially a massive cemetery. The eternal immortal domains were the only place in the entire void where life existed, and therefore, it was quite a surprise to see this flickering candlelight. Did some other group of people actually survive? Curious, he sent the treasured fan closer to the sea of light. Sure enough, he found ruins, in the middle of which was an area that didn't seem damaged at all. In fact, there was a large building there, whose dozens of windows were the source of the light. However, there was something very strange about the light, it didn't seem particularly bright. And even as he got closer, the intensity of the light didn't seem to change at all. Bai Xiaochun was immediately suspicious. He had been to many places in the void, and had seen many strange and unique things. Therefore, as he stood there on the fan, he simply packed away his curiosity and turned the fan to leave. It didn't matter that he had an Archean cultivation base, his basic personality had not changed. After seeing something suspicious, he had no desire to investigate it. Furthermore, the fluctuations coming from Bai Xiao's mark had already calmed down. In the end, Bai Xiaochun knew that he had become very strong, but based on everything he had seen, he also knew that this void was a very boundless and mysterious place. In a void like this, it's best to keep one's curiosity in check. Skirting this set of ruins, he sent the fan proceeding along its way, and prepared to continue working on his 30-colored flame. However, it was at that point that he frowned and looked out into the void ahead with narrowed eyes. There, up ahead, was some light, and it looked exactly the same as the light from before. Snorting coldly, he steered the fan around the light, and kept his divine sense spread out to scan the area. However, before long, more light appeared up ahead. "Well, isn't this interesting?" he murmured, his expression unsightly. After numerous tests, he came to find that no matter which way he turned, or how he tried to skirt the light, it would always appear in front of him. And every time, it was a bit closer than before. Eventually, he realized that he could see humanoid shapes moving about on the other side of the windows. By now, he could tell that these ruins had once been sparsely populated, but had been home to a sovereign. And the circular space that he was apparently caught in was the result of spell formations set up by those people. He had inadvertently entered the area, and would likely not find it easy to escape. As he thought about the problem, he looked at the shining windows, and could hear the faint sound of laughter and conversation from inside. At one point, one of the windows opened, and a woman appeared, pretty and flirtatious, made up, but clad only in her undergarments. Looking out at Bai Xiaochun, she waved her handkerchief in his direction and beckoned for him to approach. "Hey, come over here," she said, her voice traveling through the void and into his ears. At this point, his eyes widened, and he looked the entire building up and down. "Don't tell me this place is a brothel," he murmured, blinking. Although he was tempted to go in, he knew that he shouldn't let his curiosity get the best of him. Snorting, he turned the fan to leave. Unfortunately, he soon realized that the only way to escape was through the central node of the spell formation, which was none other than the brothel itself. Sighing, he realized that he had no other options at his disposal. And considering he was so powerful that even the old ghost woman wasn't a match for him, he decided that there was no harm in indulging in some games. In that moment, the fluctuations coming from Bai Hao's mark flared, prompting a strange look from Bai Xiaochun. Suddenly, he wondered if his apprentice actually wanted to go into the brothel. "Howard, you've been corrupted." Clearing his throat, he decided to play it safe, and sent his divine sense out to cover the entire brothel. A while later, he calmed down a bit, convinced that the unique souls inside didn't pose any threat to him. "Well, let's go check it out. Although I'm not really interested, I might as well do it for my apprentice." Clearing his throat, he summoned his 2 Archean slaves to act as bodyguards, then instructed Bai Xiaochun to be ready to come to his aid at a moment's notice if anything suspicious happened. Then, under the curious gaze of Bai Xiaochun, he swaggered off of the fan and headed toward the brothel. As he neared, the sound of singing, dancing, and laughing grew louder. Soon, the front doors swung open, and a woman dressed like the madam of the brothel appeared, flowers in her hair. Swaying forward, she looked at Bai Xiaochun with glittering eyes. "Girls," she said loudly. "We have a customer." An entire group of gorgeously dressed women all rushed forward, flirtatious smiles on their faces. "Welcome. Come in. The girls here will definitely satisfy your every need, sir." Despite having an Archean cultivation base, Bai Xiaochun was still blushing as he found himself surrounded by so many gorgeous women. Clearing his throat, he marveled at how he was willing to throw caution to the wind, all for his apprentice Bai Hao. "Oh, Howard. After feeling those energy fluctuations of yours, Master is willing to do that which he would never, ever be willing to do normally." Bai Xiaochun really was impressed with himself. Flicking his sleeve, he announced, "Bring out your best food and your finest wine." The madam of the brothel quickly called out some orders. Meanwhile, the women escorted the swaggering Bai Xiaochun into the building. The inside was alive with dazzling light, and was extravagantly decorated. Even Bai Xiaochun, who had seen many things in his life, was impressed. The tables and chairs were actually crafted from immortal jade, as were the floor tiles. There were also spell formations set up that made the entire place seem like a celestial paradise. The candles lighting the interior were made from expensive medicinal plant materials. As a grandmaster of the Tao of medicine, Bai Xiaochun could tell with a single sniff that at least 7 or 8 of those medicinal plants were actually legendary immortal plants of incalculable value. And yet, there were more than 1,000 such candles, leading the shocked Bai Xiaochun to the conclusion that these people were definitely very rich. Most astonishing of all was that, whether it was his divine sense or his physical sight, everything around him was not illusory. In other words, the building, the candles, and the floor tiles were all real. Shaken, he allowed the flirtatious women to lead him to a seat made of jade, where he sat down, heart-pounding. The women sat around him, stroking their hair seductively and chatting in lovely voices as the food and wine was served. Despite being a powerful monarch, the leader of the Arch-Emperor dynasty, Bai Xiaochun had never experienced pampering like this. Adding in the fact that he was somewhat weary from his lonely travels in the void, and this sudden change of pace was actually very exciting. After examining his wine glass closely, he laughed heartily and downed the entire glass. Then he began to devour the delicious foods and spirit fruits. The women were obviously playing hard to get, and alternated between chatting flirtatiously and shying away bashfully. At one point, a few stepped forward and began to perform a musical number that made the entire scene even more lively than before. 2 handmaidens came to massage Bai Xiaochun's neck and shoulders, and one particularly beautiful woman began to lift his wine cup up for him to drink. As for the madam, she stood off to the side, smiling affably. The 2 Archean slaves were also being attended to dutifully by several women. As all the sounds of chatting, laughter, and music mixed together, Bai Xiaochun laughed loudly, and his eyes began to shine with bright light. Were it not for the fact that Bai Hao's mark continued to pulse, Bai Xiaochun would have simply relaxed and enjoyed himself after his long journeys. However, as time passed, the madam's smile began to grow more and more mysterious. And the eyes of the women, whether the dancers or the musicians, and even the 2 maidens massaging Bai Xiaochun, began to glow with mysterious light. Their fingernails began to turn black and grow longer, and their expressions began to turn vicious. Their hair even grew longer. It all happened relatively quickly, as Bai Xiaochun's eyes were closed in relaxation. Within moments, the madam had completely transformed into a vicious, evil ghost. Eyes flickering with avarice, she leapt into the air toward Bai Xiaochun. Apparently, her movement was the signal. All of the other women completely transformed into evil ghosts who pounced on either Bai Xiaochun or his 2 Archean slaves. Shrill howls filled the air as the music stopped, and the candle light suddenly turned green and deathly. The ground was also different. The floor tiles were now made from bones, making the entire place seem like a graveyard. The building itself even seemed to wither up, until it looked like nothing less than a graveyard. Strangely, the delicious food and wine did not change. Somehow, these evil ghosts had actually produced real food and beverages. As all of these changes happened, and as the women turned into evil ghosts and lunged toward Bai Xiaochun and his Archean slaves, Bai Xiaochun was sitting there, humming a little tune. But then, his eyes snapped open. "Pipe down," he said, looking displeased. Waving his sleeve, he sent out a burst of energy that sent the evil ghosts tumbling backward, miserable shrieks echoing out of their mouths, and looks of surprise lighting up their eyes. The Archean slaves drew on the full power of their cultivation bases, blurring into motion to block both the front entrance and rear exit. Divine sense erupting out, they prevented any of the evil ghosts from fleeing. Even as the evil ghosts continued to shriek, and those who Bai Xiaochun had already hurt continued to tumble backward, he turned his glare onto the madam. Her face fell, and she made to flee, but before she could, Bai Xiaochun reached out and grabbed her. "Change back immediately," he said with head held high. "Lord Bai doesn't get to see ordinary little ghosts very often. How dare you transform and try to scare me? Hurry up, enough chatter. Change back and start dancing again." For years, he had been afraid of ghosts, and through all that time, had never even thought to imagine that the day would arrive in which he would frighten the ghosts. As far as he was concerned, he was only one step away from being at the ultimate peak of life. However, he still felt as if something were missing, and began to contemplate whether using the soul of the madam to conjure a flame would be the perfect touch. However, it was at that point that the fluctuations coming from Bai Hao grew more intense. Bai Xiaochun said. After a moment of thought, he pushed the madam's soul toward the mark on the back of his hand. As soon as the two of them touched, the mark erupted with gravitational force, and dragged the screaming madam inside. After absorbing the madam's soul, fluctuations of satisfaction appeared from Bai Hao's mark, which then faded into calm after a moment. Apparently, it was only the soul of the madam that had been needed. Bai Hao didn't seem to care about the other ghosts at all. Chuckling, Bai Xiaochun smacked the table. "I finished my wine. Bring some more." In response, the evil ghosts all quickly transformed back into gorgeous women, their eyes shining with dread as they looked at Bai Xiaochun. The fact that he had absorbed the soul of the madam was horrifying to them, leaving them trembling in fear. Immediately, they resumed their singing and dancing, and began to serve Bai Xiaochun again. However, they were so scared that both their dancing and singing was affected. It was the same with the girls massaging his shoulders. Closing his eyes, Bai Xiaochun reveled in his success. Slowly, the women began to calm down, and hoped that he would leave as quickly as possible. Of course, there was no way Bai Xiaochun would let them off the hook so easily. He enjoyed his surroundings for a whole day, helping himself to vast portions of delicious food and fine wine. The following evening, he opened his eyes, and realized that it was time to resume his lonely journey through the void. However, he was in a very good mood. After all, it was rare to find moments of enjoyment like this. These women are all souls, but they're definitely unique. It would be a big waste to leave them here. Maybe when I get back to the Arch-Emperor dynasty, I can have them do a bit of singing and dancing. Having reached the conclusion that this was definitely the best idea, his heart began to pound. After all, ever since his love letters had been confiscated, he had felt like his bag of holding was missing something. Eyes shining, he said, "What I've been missing is some good singing and dancing. Yeah, I'll take them with me. Next time I see the Saint Emperor, I'll show him, and he'll be completely envious." Convinced that this was definitely the best thing to do, he waved his hand as he rose to his feet. "From now all of you girls are with me." Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.